You know, as much as I love certain TV shows, I have to admit that I can't really think of one that I was especially fond of growing up. Oh, don't get me wrong, there were definitely shows I watched and enjoyed, but there weren't really any I felt that connected to. I didn't have any I just had to watch every single week, at least not until my teenage years. Yeah, for whatever reason, it wasn't until I reached my teens that I started to find TV shows I wanted to follow every week, but even then, it wasn't like I couldn't miss an episode or two of most of them. Hell, several of them were shows I didn't get introduced to until several seasons had already aired, so I still hadn't found anything I could say was my show. However, that all changed when I heard about a new show featuring a certain DC superhero and his experiences during his teenage years. I still wasn't quite sold on it though, even after I saw a trailer for it, as it seemed a bit too much like one of those teen drama things like Dawson's Creek, which were definitely not for me. Still, I decided to give it a try, and from the moment I did, I was hooked. Over the next 10 years, I rarely missed an episode, and when I did, I tried my best to catch a rerun or something before the next episode aired. There was just something about this show that really spoke to me, and although it wasn't exactly perfect, this was definitely something I could and indeed did follow and grow up with as it progressed. With all of that in mind, I thought that maybe now would be as good a time as any to revisit this show and see how it holds up. Maybe my love for the show was just a teenage crush of sorts, or maybe it's even better than I remember. I have a feeling it might be a bit of both, but I guess we'll find out as I take you on a journey through a place called Smallville. So I guess we better start by explaining exactly what this show is for those who may not be too familiar with it. Basically, Smallville is the story of Clark Kent, also known as Superman, and his experiences as a superpowered teenage boy in the small town of Smallville. Now, this setup may not be for everyone, but personally, I find it rather intriguing. Sure, not everyone will care about this sort of thing, and you do have to suspend your disbelief quite a bit at a few junctures, but I for one would like to know a bit more about how Clark Kent got through high school, while also coming to terms with his powers, not to mention keep them a secret. That said, the show doesn't solely focus on Clark and his schooling. After all, it would be rather pointless to have a show based on a guy with superpowers if those powers never come into play. As such, the show also provides Clark with several sticky situations and dangerous villains to contend with. In fact, the first season almost takes that a bit too far. Before I get into that though, let's take a look at some of the characters. First and foremost, we have Clark Kent, played by Tom Welling. If you know anything at all about Superman, you already know his story. He's an alien who crash lands on Earth during a meteor shower and is found and adopted by a couple of farmers, Jonathan and Martha Kent. As normal as Clark may look though, he certainly isn't. He turns out to be both super strong and super fast, something that Kent's fear may lead him to be taken away and experimented on should it be discovered. They therefore decide to keep his origins a secret, even from Clark himself, which they somehow managed to do for years. Yeah, this is something they never fully explain, but somehow the Kents managed to hide Clark's secret not only from the government and everyone in town, but also from Clark. They do make it seem like they explained his powers to him as some sort of condition he just has, but he doesn't learn the full truth until the middle or so of the first episode, by which point he's in his teens. You see, on his way home from school one day, Clark is hit by a car driven by Lex Luthor, and both of them go flying off a bridge into a river. Clark manages to pull Lex out and save his life though, as he himself remains strangely unscathed. After confronting his father about this, Jonathan finally reveals the truth to him.
What are you trying to tell me, Dad? That I'm from another planet? I suppose you stashed my spaceship in the attic.
Actually, it's in the storm cellar. This is how you came into our world, son.
Now, I'm willing to suspend my disbelief quite a bit, especially in this sort of thing, but this really doesn't work. You're seriously telling me Clark never stumbled across this thing while playing as a child? None of his friends ever hid down there when they played hide and seek? Seriously, I just don't buy this. I guess it's not such a big deal. I mean, it is pretty much just a device for moving the story along, but they might as well have him know the full truth from the start. I just don't see the point in making this a surprise to him, as it doesn't really further the story all that much. In fact, I'm not quite sure it accomplishes anything of value, so yeah, this whole thing could just as well have been cut. In any case, Clark is far from the only character in this show, as you should already have figured out. We also have his parents, Jonathan and Martha Kent, played by John Schneider and Annette O'Toole. Once again, these characters are much the same as other incarnations, with one fairly noticeable exception. They're quite a bit younger in this version. I guess this was done because they knew these characters would be a bit more involved and active than in other iterations, and for the most part, I don't mind it at all. They're still very likable, and I enjoy seeing them get more screen time than usual. Besides, it wasn't exactly vital to the storyline that Clark's parents were older, so overall, I think this solution is just as good, if not better than usual. Clark also has a few friends he interacts with and who helps him out from time to time. Firstly, there's Pete Ross, played by Sam Jones III, who's basically Clark's childhood friend and the son of a neighbouring farmer. These two are about as close to brothers as you can get without actually being related, and their relationship ends up going through quite a few developments over the show's run. Secondly, there's Chloe Sullivan, played by Alison Mack, the editor of the school newspaper. She's Clark's closest female friend, although she actually wishes their relationship was a bit more than that. They do end up going through various stages of friendship and romance over the course of the show, but for the most part they're just friends. Chloe is also the one who makes the connection between the strange events of the town and the arrival of the meteors. In fact, she has a bit of a theory as to what is actually going on, and she's ended up making kind of a mural to reflect that idea.
I call it the Wall of Weird. It's every strange, bizarre, and unexplained event that's happened in Smallville since the meteor shower. That's when it all began. The town went schizo.
Yeah, basically, Chloe believes that most of the bizarre events in Smallville can be traced back to the meteor shower, and that the meteors themselves can have all sorts of effects on human beings. This might seem like a bit of a stretch, but then again, she does turn out to be right, so if anything, you should blame the writing for that, not Chloe as a character. In any case, while Chloe and Clark may have a few romantic moments, Clark's true love is Lana Lang, played by Kristen Kroik. She is Clark's neighbor and his long-running and hopeless crush. In fact, his constant obsessing over this poor girl can almost get a bit creepy at times. Like, when he's basically peeping on her through his telescope. That's not charming, that's sick! Still, if Clark is so interested, he should just go for it and ask her out, right? Well, it turns out it's not as simple as that. For one thing, Clark tends to get rather awkward and queasy whenever he's around her, and it turns out that it's not just because of his feelings for her. You see, Lana usually wears a certain necklace her aunt made her that contains a piece of meteor rock from the meteor shower that killed her parents. The problem with this is that Clark is sort of allergic to these rocks, becoming weak whenever he's around them, something that ends up being a constant obstacle for him to overcome whenever he's facing his enemies. In addition to that, Lana isn't even available. She has a boyfriend named Whitney Fordman, played by Eric Johnson, and he's even a pretty decent guy. Okay, so he does pull one pretty mean and kinda dangerous stunt on Clark after he gets jealous of the time Lana's been spending with him, but after that, he's actually pretty respectful and nice to him, at least for the most part. Actually, Whitney ends up being a rather refreshing change of pace as far as romantic adversaries go. Like I mentioned, he and Clark may have their disagreements, but they're definitely more friends than enemies. It's just so nice to for once have someone who might be a romantic rival, but who's not just some stereotypical bully. It actually makes sense that Lana would want to date him. As for actual villains, the first season doesn't introduce many long-running ones, but it does have two characters that actually end up kind of stealing the show, at least in my opinion. Sure, they do take a few liberties with them, especially in terms of their connection with Clark and his family, but then this is supposed to be a somewhat new adaptation, and I actually think it works for the better. I am of course talking about Lex and Lionel Luthor, played by Michael Rosenbaum and John Glover. In this version, Lex isn't really a villain though. He actually starts out more as a friend to Clark after Clark saves his life. Oh, he does have a rather shady past, and I don't think I would exactly call him a good person, but he's certainly not thoroughly evil either, at least not at first. As for Lionel though, he's more of the evil prick you might have expected Lex to be. For example, he might be Lex's father, but you wouldn't exactly call their relationship healthy. From pretty much the beginning of the show, we're shown how Lionel is ruthless in his parenting style, pretty much tormenting his son for his failings.
This has got to stop. Open your eyes, Lex.
I can't.
Luthors are not afraid. We don't have that luxury. We're leaders. You have a destiny, Lex. You're never gonna get anywhere with your eyes closed.
This certainly doesn't get any better after Lex is caught in a meteor blast and somehow loses his hair. Just look at Lionel's face. That's a look of pure disgust. From this moment on, Lionel constantly tests and manipulates Lex under the guise of fatherly guidance, something Lex is far too clever to fall for. That's kind of the basis for how Lex ends up in Smallville in the first place. Lionel sends him there to take over his fertilizer plant. But as Lex and even Lionel himself points out, it's actually just a way for him to keep Lex at arm's length as well as test his resolve.
You know perfectly well how I feel about you.
Hence, I'm at a crap factory in Smallville.
Lex, did you know the Caesars would send their sons to the furthermost corners of the Empire so they could get an appreciation of how the world works?
Whatever helps you sleep at night, Dad.
Like I mentioned, these two characters and their relationship and experiences are actually so intriguing and work so well that they do end up somewhat upstaging the leading role himself. Oh, there are plenty of spectacular moments involving Clark as well, but Lex and Lionel are far more interesting and enjoyable to watch, at least for the most part. Getting back to the story though, this first season would become known as the Freak of the Week season. Oh, there are a few overarching elements as well, but for the most part, this season consists of fairly self-contained single-episode stories with new villains each week. This is both beneficial and detrimental to the show's quality, but ultimately, this probably wasn't the best choice. Don't get me wrong, it's not like the later seasons don't have a certain amount of single-episode stories as well, but they do seem to have more overarching and season-long storylines. I for one think that works a bit better, at least for this type of show, as it seems more suited to longer multi-part storylines. Okay, so it is pretty neat to have several villains that can be anything from terrifying to just rather silly, but as they only get one episode each, there's not as much room to develop them, and it also ends up making the show that much more formulaic. Seriously, most of the episodes of Season 1 can be summed up with only a few identical steps. It usually starts with someone gaining some sort of power via an accident involving meteor rocks. This newly powered person then causes some sort of trouble that Clark Kent is somehow always involved with, and Clark ends up stopping them before they do too much harm, usually after having dealt with some meteor rock based obstacle. Obviously, there are a few variations of this formula from time to time, but most episodes do tend to follow it to a T. While this doesn't exactly ruin the show as you still get some pretty excellent villains and storylines, it does end up making you feel like you're watching almost the same episode again and again, which ultimately does make it less intriguing. As for the more overarching stories, they mostly involve Clark coming to terms with his powers. You see, he doesn't actually have all of his abilities from the get-go. He starts out with just super speed and super strength. Over the course of the show though, he develops several other powers, the main one of this season being X-ray vision. In the episode rather blatantly titled X-Ray, Clark encounters a bank robber impersonating Lex, and when I say impersonate, I mean by literally turning into Lex. After Clark gets thrown through a store window, he somehow experiences a flash of X-ray vision, during which he sees that the bank robber's skeleton has some weird green stuff all over it. After later having another seizure during a gym class and getting quite a nice view of the girls' locker room, he decides to inform his parents about this new development, and they end up taking it rather well. Better than he does, in fact.
Clark, I'm sure there's some way to control this.
You guys, I can see through things. How do you control that?
You gotta practice, Clark. Your eyes have muscles, just like your legs.
Mom is right, son. Look, all you have to do is you have to figure out a way to condition them so that you don't get these random flashes.
Well, that sounds great. How am I gonna do that?
Well, I guess you could start by not being such a whiny bitch about this. I mean, you just experienced pretty much every teenage boy's fantasy back in that gym class, which you seem to enjoy quite a lot, I might add, but all you can think about is how this will be so difficult to deal with. Seriously, most of us would kill for an ability like that, so shut your ungrateful little bitch mouth! Anyway, Clark does eventually manage to get a handle on this new power, as he ends up using it to figure out that the bank robber is actually Tina Greer, one of his fellow students. She apparently underwent some experimental surgery utilizing meteor rocks as a child to cure her soft bone disease, the result of which was that she ended up super strong and able to shapeshift. Tina is also rather obsessed with Lana Lang, who is her childhood friend. Envious of her seemingly perfect life, Tina ends up actually kidnapping Lana in an attempt to take over her life after she is less than enthusiastic about Tina moving in with her and her aunt. Clark obviously manages to thwart her plans and save Lana though, after finally mastering his new ability. This season also has a fair amount of focus on Lex, his attempts to assert his independence from his father, and his rather shady past. For example, there's an episode titled Zero, where a rather nasty incident from Lex's past finally comes back to haunt him. While inspecting the renovation of the Talon, a movie theater / coffee shop he's reopening with Lana, Lex is confronted by his former bodyguard. He claims that he's being stalked by someone named Jude, which should be impossible as he's supposed to be dead. After telling this bodyguard to go to his apartment in the city, Lex sends him away and goes with Clark to check on the Talon. Unfortunately, Lana then informs him that she was just approached by someone who warned her to stay away from Lex, claiming that he's a dangerous man. This man claimed his name was Jude Royce, which seems to rattle Lex quite a bit, although he tries to convince Clark otherwise. When he gets in his car though, there's a bit of a surprise waiting for him.
I don't know! You under the desk? What were the screams?
I assume it's someone's twisted idea of a joke.
Lex.
Clark, this really doesn't concern you.
Later, Lex is contacted by the contractor working on the Talon as he has an estimate ready for him, but when he, Lana and Clark enter, they find the contractor lying on the floor with a bruise on his head. He says he was attacked by someone who forced his way in, and then Clark spots a mysterious box with Lex's name on it sitting on a nearby counter.
Zero consequences.
Yes, it turns out that someone killed the bodyguard from earlier and placed his hand in this box for Lex to find as some sort of message. Things only get worse when there's a chemical spill on the Kent farm, seemingly caused by Luthor Corp, but actually caused by someone trying to frame Lex. This someone approaches Lex disguised as a CEP agent, tasers him, and takes him away in a van. When Lex wakes up, he finds himself hanging upside down in an abandoned warehouse, being confronted by a man claiming to be none other than Jude Royce. He wants Lex to tell him the truth about an event he was involved with in a dance club in Metropolis called Club Zero 3 years earlier. You see, on that night, Lex went to this club with Jude's fiancée Amanda under the pretense of celebrating her engagement, but he actually brought her there so she could catch Jude cheating on her, something Lex seemingly made possible in the first place. After Amanda confronts Jude and starts walking away from him, he and Lex end up in a fight on the dance floor. Jude eventually pulls out a knife and stabs Lex, after which someone shoots him. The official story was that Lex's bodyguard was the one who shot Jude, but the resurfaced Jude refuses to believe this, claiming Lex had the truth covered up. As it turns out, Lex was indeed lying, as he told the detective on the scene that he was actually the one who shot Jude, something this detective helped him cover up in exchange for a big payoff. However, during Jude's torture, Lex eventually reveals that this was in fact a lie as well, as the actual shooter was apparently Amanda. Yes, after the new Jude is killed and revealed to be just a body double, Lex is suddenly confronted by the contractor from the Talon, who actually turns out to be Amanda's brother and the one behind this whole thing. He informs Lex that Amanda ended up committing suicide, something he blames on Lex and the events of that night. After learning all of this, Lex decides to tell him the real truth.
God is a DJ.
No, you're twisting it again.
That's what happened!
Yes, Lex claims he was just trying to protect Amanda as he knew his father wouldn't hesitate to throw her to the wolves, but that he'd do anything to protect his son. Amanda's brother still doesn't believe him, and although he manages to fire a shot at Lex, he somehow misses as Clark comes in at the last minute to save Lex and knock this guy unconscious. The brilliant thing about this particular episode is how it keeps you guessing, even after the credits roll. We still don't really know which version of the events of that night was the truth, as Lex could have been trying to protect Amanda, or he could be covering his own arse. Even when Clark confronts him at the end, he doesn't really give a straight answer.
Is it the truth? The truth is, I do anything to protect my friends.
Kind of ambiguous, wouldn't you say? Seriously, that answer could easily be interpreted in a few different ways, which kind of starts laying the groundwork for this character. There's definitely good in him, but his past is so shady and he's so good at twisting the truth that you can never truly trust him either. This is even more evident when it comes to Lex's obsession with the car crash Clark rescued him from. He's convinced there's more to it than Clark lets on, and he goes to extreme lengths to figure out every aspect of that incident. He even hires a corrupt newspaper reporter to investigate the crash and spy on Clark, which all comes to a head in the season finale. I'll get into that a bit later, but first I just want to talk a bit more about the season as a whole. Like I said, it is mostly a so-called Freak of the Week season, and that means that the show's quality varies even more than otherwise from one episode to the next. I would still call it a mostly competent and entertaining season overall, but some episodes are definitely better than others. For my money, the best episode here is probably Jitters, the 8th episode of the season. Sure, Zero is a pretty good one as well, but I think this one just barely tips the scales in its favour. After all, this is the episode that provides us with our first taste of the darker, more secretive workings of Luthor Corp. While his parents are away celebrating their anniversary, Clark decides to host a party in his house. Of course, it ends up getting a bit out of hand when a lot more people than he intends shows up, including someone hiding in his barn attic. Luckily, this mysterious stranger turns out to be an old friend of the Kents named Earl Jenkins, played pretty excellently by Tony Todd. Before anyone can figure out what he's doing there though, he suddenly has some sort of violent spasm, which seems to have something to do with meteor rocks, as Clark has the same reaction to touching him as he does to being around those. After Earl's brought to the hospital, the police come looking for him as well. It seems he accidentally killed the janitor the night before when he tried to get into a Luthor Corp building to see Lionel Luthor. Why did he need to do this?
I was assigned to clean level 3. They were doing these hush-hush crop experiments. There was a huge explosion. I was cleaning at the time, and the stuff, it got under my skin. Then 2 months ago, the jitters started.
Did you see a doctor?
I must have seen 50. They needed to know what I was exposed to. But when I went back to the plant, they told me that level 3 didn't exist, that it never had. I gotta get back into that plant, or I'm gonna die.
Neither Jonathan nor Clark are quite sure what to make of all of this, but Earl certainly is. In fact, after having another spasm and escaping from his police guards, he ends up sneaking into the fertilizer plant to find level 3, but it no longer seems to exist. Luckily for him though, it turns out Clark and his classmates just so happen to be on a field trip to that same plant at that very moment. As Earl is very desperate, he ends up taking them all hostage, demanding to be taken to level 3 before he starts killing them. The plant is immediately put on lockdown as Lex and Lionel work together with SWAT, as well as Jonathan and Martha Kent, to come up with a satisfactory solution for all involved. Unfortunately, Lionel seems less than interested in actually solving the situation as opposed to just cleaning it up, initially even refusing to talk to Earl. When Lex convinces him otherwise, things only get worse.
Just tell me what you were using down on level 3.
You're sick, Earl.
Let everyone go. We'll get you help.
See what you made me do.
Way to go, Dad.
Yup, it seems methane gas is now filling up the room as well, making it a matter of time before everything goes up in flames. Somehow. No, I'm no expert, and apparently certain gases can self-combust under certain conditions, but I was relatively certain methane still required some sort of ignition before exploding. Either way, time is running out, so Lex decides to go in to try and reason with Earl. Lex manages to convince him to release the hostages, claiming he'll take him to level 3 if he does so. After Earl agrees, Lex reveals to Clark that this was just a ploy on his part, which makes Clark separate from the others on his way out in an attempt to find level 3 on his own. Using his X-ray vision, Clark discovers a secret elevator hidden behind a wall where Earl said it would be. Clark informs Earl of this before he rushes off to shut down the gas, as Earl drags Lex with him to the elevator. Unfortunately, it seems level 3 still remains elusive, as the elevator only has 2 buttons. Or does it?
2 buttons. 2 levels. I'm sorry, all right?
Sadly, it seems someone's been busy cleaning up, as level 3 is just an empty warehouse now. Lex claims not to have a clue about any of this, as Clark shows up right before Earl has another seizure, which causes the walkway he and Lex are standing on to collapse. Luckily, Clark pulls both of them back up to safety, as the episode ends with Lex vowing to find a cure for Earl's condition. Okay, so I guess I wouldn't call this a perfect episode, but I still think it's probably the best episode of the season. It's the first time we get to see just how slimy, secretive, and conniving Lionel can actually be, and the juxtaposition of his and Lex's relationship versus the relationship Clark has with his parents is perfectly executed. The performances are also fantastic all around in this episode. John Glover does a perfect job of portraying what a ruthless and shifty businessman Lionel is in just his expressions. It's utterly brilliant. Like, just look at how he reacts when he's informed that they have to seal off the plant due to the gas levels rising.
Your son will be sealed inside. I'm sorry, sir.
Do it.
That delivery and that look just says it all, doesn't it? He's ever so slightly hesitant, but he'd rather sacrifice his own son than have to admit to him or the press that he was actually involved with any sort of failed and probably illegal experiments. He's not going to show any sort of weakness, and he's certainly not going to chance his company receiving any sort of bad press if he can avoid it. This character's phoniness is also perfectly captured in the final scene. After he and Lex have been reunited and the press shows up, he brushes them off saying he needs some time with his son as he hugs him, but it's not exactly a loving hug. It's just a calculated move to avoid having to answer any tough questions, as opposed to the actual loving hug the Kents are seen sharing at the same time. All in all, this episode just works. It has suspense, fantastic acting, and Clark and his powers are utilized rather well, if a bit sparsely. No, it's not really the most action-filled episode there is, but all things considered, it is at least my favorite of this season. As for the worst episode, that is actually a bit easier to narrow down. You see, there's an episode that contains a certain scene that always bugged me, as it doesn't really add up. Okay, so the episode itself isn't anything truly terrible, but as it does contain what I would say is the biggest error of the season, I'll have to call it the worst episode overall. I'm talking about the episode titled Rogue. In it, a corrupt Metropolis PD detective named Sam Phelan, who was the detective who helped Lex cover up the events of Club Zero, spots Clark using his powers to stop a runaway bus, and before anyone possibly suggests it, no, that's not really the scene I have a problem with. Oh, this scene does have some rather big problems as well. Like, how the hell did the driver walk away from this when Clark basically smashes in the entire front of the bus and causes a huge explosion? The driver's lucky he didn't get vaporized, so I don't really buy that he would be able to walk away without as much as a fucking scratch. Anyway, after seeing Clark use his powers, Phelan tracks him down and blackmails him to help him steal some files pertaining to an internal affairs investigation against him. Clark ends up double-crossing him though, believing he's managed to put him behind bars for good. Unfortunately, the Smallville police then receive a tip from Metropolis PD as they show up on the Kent farm with a warrant to search the premises. They eventually find a dead body and a gun as Jonathan is arrested and taken into custody. Phelan then shows up to inform Clark that he's the one behind this and that he'll be in touch to set up another job for Clark. This job turns out to be a museum heist, as Phelan later reveals he wants Clark's help retrieving a very valuable breastplate. They cut the wires to the museum's security system, and Phelan calls in a phony bomb threat to get rid of the guards. After getting a hold of the breastplate, Clark once again double-crosses Phelan by tossing it through a window to the guards outside, knowing Phelan's prints are the only ones on the breastplate. He then speeds out of the museum as Phelan gets shot by the guards. Like I said, this is by no means a terrible episode, but it is the one with the most glaring and obvious issues. I mentioned the whole bus crash thing earlier, but the one that really bugs me has to do with the final scene of the episode. You see, a subplot of this episode has to do with Lex trying to figure out what Phelan is using to blackmail Clark. As such, he winds up at the museum at the same time as Clark, only he doesn't actually see him there, and he doesn't get the answers he wants from Phelan before he dies. However, he does apparently get a hold of some rather confusing security footage. Now, I could be missing something, and there might be ways you could bullshit your way around this, but how the hell did Lex get this footage? How does it even exist? We clearly see Phelan cut the security, even going so far as to point out how the cameras specifically are dead.
Cameras are all dead in Luther Hall.
Well, how the hell could they have captured this footage then? If they're offline, there shouldn't be any footage for Lex to look over in the first place. So what you're telling me is that either there just happened to be a camera in the exact right spot that just happened to remain online, or there was some sort of remote backup system or something, neither of which is a very good explanation. Ultimately, I think we all know what this scene is all about. They just needed something that would make Lex even more suspicious of Clark than he already was, but I don't think this was the best way to do so. Again, you can't technically explain this in some convoluted fashion or another, but we all know they just fucked up. It's a continuity error, nothing else. They just didn't think we'd notice. In any case, I think I should think about wrapping this up, so let's end by talking a bit about the final episode of the season, titled Tempest. It takes place during Smallville High's prom that Clark and Chloe have agreed to go to together. Unfortunately, there's also a bit of a storm brewing, in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The thing is that before the actual prom, Clark notices that Lex has apparently discovered a missing piece of his spaceship, something Lex's hired and corrupt reporter Roger Nixon overhears while spying on the Kents. He therefore pays Lex a bit of a visit, both to retrieve this ship piece and to try and extort a bit more money out of him for his discovery. Meanwhile, Lana and Whitney are having a picnic when he informs her that he's enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in order to follow in his recently deceased father's footsteps. Unfortunately, he ships out on the day of the prom, so he won't be able to take her. He also asks her to wait for him until he returns, something she's not sure she can do. We also find out that Lionel plans to shut down the fertilizer plant, citing management issues, all in a ploy to get Lex to return to Metropolis as more or less his lackey. In an attempt to avoid this, Lex meets with some of the plant workers in order to convince them to buy out Lionel's shares and form a new company under the leadership of Lex. Getting back to Clark, he's busy putting up a new fence on the farm. After driving a few poles into the ground and getting into his truck, something kind of unexpected happens. That's right, Nixon set up that explosion to test Clark, and he later confronts him about this miraculous ability of his, claiming he wants to write a story about him. Clark denies that he was even near the truck at the time, of course, and even though Lex steps in and scares Nixon off, he doesn't give up quite that easily. Instead, he waits until the night of the prom when the Kents are all out of their house and sneaks into their storm cellar. Once there, he of course finds Clark's spaceship and even films it as proof of his discovery. Meanwhile, the students at Smallville High are informed that there's apparently 3 tornado funnels headed their way, but that they'll be fine as long as they stay inside the school. Unfortunately, Lana is still out in the open, having just said goodbye to Whitney, something Clark remembers as he rushes off to ensure her safety. In the Luthor mansion, Lionel comes in to confront Lex about his bold decision to buy him out of the Smallville plant. After exchanging a few threats and platitudes for a while, the storm picks up, crashing through the mansion as Lionel ends up trapped underneath a column. Unfortunately for him, Lex doesn't exactly rush to his rescue.
Help me! Lex! Please!
Back at the Kent farm, the spaceship piece Nixon was holding suddenly slips out of his hand and merges with the ship as Jonathan and Martha, who are seeking shelter from the storm, comes in to confront him. After Jonathan and Nixon have a bit of a scuffle, the ship suddenly begins to hover as Nixon slips away. Ignoring the storm, Jonathan runs after him as Martha sees the ship start to glow. While all this is going on, Lana has crashed her truck and is stuck in a ditch as the 3 funnels merge into one gigantic one and start creeping closer and closer. Clark then suddenly whooshes in, but it seems he may just be the teeniest bit too late.